They're the models that you might be able to see, but you just can't shoot. Let's talk lone operatives and Warhammer 40k, and why as a class they tend to be pretty great in game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking lone operatives, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of the class in general, talk about the rule and why it's pretty interesting in game right now, run through a few of the biggest advantages they get, and maybe some of the ways they're most commonly countered, talk through a few of the best and brightest lone operatives out there, and a few similar rules that work in some slightly different ways. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. The lone operative rule in Warhammer 40k is a fairly simple one on the face of it. Unless your lone operative is one of the rare ones that can attach to a unit and act as a leader, the basic rule is that you can't shoot that model if your attacking model is greater than 12 inches away. It's done on a model by model basis, so that means that you might be able to have half a squad able to shoot that lone operative, but the other half unable to. It's not an all or nothing thing, and it basically gives you guaranteed safety against enemy ranged fire unless the foe can get in close. I feel like they might vary in importance a little bit from game to game, given that in some games you might be facing an incredibly mobile opponent or someone with loads of deep strikers who might be able to get in where they need to, or you might be playing against an enemy army that's going to do almost all of its damage in melee, in which case they don't really care too much about this rule. For armies that rely on being able to shoot your units down from long range though, it's really quite a godsend, and due to the frustration and problems it can cause them, they tend to be priced at a premium for this powerful rule. So at least compared with other choices in the codex, they don't tend to be the most efficient thing in damage and defense just for raw might, otherwise they'd be basically auto-include. In 40k there's loads of lone operatives that have all manner of value for different things they can do, but I would argue that they are just very good just in their own right. Literally having a model that your opponent can't interact with at long range has value all of its own. And you do basically see people still taking lone operatives that do almost nothing else besides have that rule and move around. Maybe a good example being the blue scribes for Chaos Demons that were maybe kind of often seen as allies when you didn't have to pay a troops tax for them. Very little actual damage or use for those models, just literally a lone operative that can run around quickly and do objectives and be annoying. I feel like some of the low damage lone operative units might not be the most obvious units to pick for newer players. Most of them aren't going to tend to actually win you the game in a damage point of view. You need to get the value out of whatever they can do, plus also use their lone operative abilities to have various powerful things for objectives. Maybe for a typical generic sort of lone operative, people might often deploy them perhaps just behind the front line, and then they can be an annoying nuisance that can act in a whole load of different ways depending on how the battle unfolds. First up, you can know that you can get an 100% safe primary objective provided your opponent can't deep strike next to it or get units on the board to it. Could be really big for that extra bit of insurance on your home objective, say if your opponent's got some really powerful artillery that might gun down any other objective holders. It could also be relevant on midfield objectives as well against a gunline force. Maybe if you can have a lone operative on a far-flung one that's a long way away from the core of their force, they might not have the damage enough to destroy it up close. If you are loitering around in the backfield, your unit can be a screening unit that your opponent can't clear at range. If there's lots of deep strike reserves, then even a small base of a single character miniature, they can still deny up to an entire 18-inch diameter circle on the table, which is quite a lot of space, and they can do so right in the open without having to worry about long-range firepower. While they're just sitting there, maybe scoring some primary points, they could also be a cheap unit to do secondary objectives as well. As mentioned, often their damage isn't enormously crazily standout, as they're often sort of mid to low tier characters. Let's say if you had to forego their shooting, doing something like deploy teleport homer or cleanse or investigating some signals, then it could be some excellent grunt work for them to do. It does mean that both cheap and fast lone operatives are particularly interesting to have on the board, as that means that you're losing out less for their damage output, and they could also get where they need to be for those secondary objectives. While they're doing their things, maybe dropping in to do secondary objectives or contesting primaries, they could potentially be a unit that could give your opponent some difficult decisions as to what they do with their units, as you have to move within 12 inches of them to interact with them at all. You might genuinely have an opponent's unit that's got no real good option. Do they sit on that midfield point and don't attack that lone operative as they can't get range on it, or do they go after it towards the periphery of the board? Perhaps shoot and kill it or charge and kill it, and then wind up out of position or out in the open for next turn. Finally, while all the slightly more nebulous things are going on, generally all of them will have at least some interesting damage output or special rules that they bring to the table. I feel like for plenty of lone operatives, that's almost like the bonus in some cases. Being a cheap lone operative definitely has just good value in itself, but I feel like to get the absolute most out of them, you'd likely want to both get the value out of their lone operative objective shenanigans, and also at the right point of the game, maybe a little bit later on, commit to dealing damage or expending them for the mission. Exactly how it's best to use them though will really depend on the actual one. Maybe they've got the ability to jump in and try and assassinate an enemy character, or is a unit that might have enough chance to take down a lighter infantry squad before it gets killed, using those lone operative protection rules to make sure they get the jump on the enemy and not the other way around. For ways to potentially think about countering lone operatives, obviously you can just try and get within 12 inches and destroy them. That's the blindingly obvious one, though it's not always going to be easy depending if they're a bit further back in the enemy army. And even if you can get within that range, you might still not necessarily have line of sight. You could deploy lone operatives by terrain so that the angle that they're threatened from could be shielded from view from a ruin or something. Going back with manipulating enemy movement as well. If units do decide that they need to venture within that 12 inches, they could be setting themselves up for easy counter-attack for other enemies. For other options for counter lone operatives though, perhaps one of the slightly rarer ones are non-shooting ranged abilities, things like Typhus's mortal wounds that he dishes out just based on his datasheet rule, or the Thousand Suns Doom Bolt. Those ones aren't technically shooting attacks, so can interact with lone operatives that are protected from shooting, and that could potentially cause surprises for people. Typhus blasting down a lone operative out to 24-inch range, and Thousand Suns Doom Bolt could even be amplified up to double the range on a Kabbalistic ritual with a Mutalith Vortex Beast. Your opponent might not be expecting their lone operatives to get gunned down when they're a vast amount of distance away from any threats. Otherwise, if they're on the periphery, then deep strike's a really good option. You might just be able to get within 9 inches of one when they deep strike down, and then just destroy them as a fairly low toughness target to shooting. If they're screened by other units on the board, though, maybe things like a 3-inch deep strike could potentially be helpful. Obviously, that's really valuable, but that would be the last thing that a lone operative would like, to have a big scary unit drop literally right next to them, even if they happen to be screened from 9-inch deep strike, and just take them off the table without much effort. If you can't get to them, or they're going to be problematically tough when you do catch up with them, it might just be best to literally try and ignore them when you're able. Focus on destroying the units that you can do, and make sure that if they do try and destroy your unit, they're not going to be in a good position to go toe to toe with whatever you've put there. Actually hunting them down and destroying them might genuinely not be a top priority versus the other enemy models. I thought for a few examples of strong ones, it could be interesting just to talk through a few lone operative datasheets that are kind of often seen in competitive play. This one's definitely not supposed to be an exhaustive list or anything like that, but just a few examples that I find particularly interesting. The Callous Assassin is perhaps far too a common sight for Imperial armies at 90 points right now. Fairly flimsy and easy to kill as it goes, with only 4 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save, but she brings some fun things to the table, able to repeatedly return to reserve, which allows her to jump around the board doing secondary objectives, often the main reason that she's taken. But she also has one of those ruin stratagem type rules with Reign of Confusion to increase a battle tactic by 1 CP, and enough melee damage to certainly worry some support characters out there, with high AP lethal hits and precision, plus a neural shredder for anti-infantry. If the opponent does leave character type units too close to her, she could definitely go through them quite quickly. Add all that to the previously mentioned lone operative style disruption that you can have options for, and she's quite an interesting choice to add to most Imperial armies at this cost. For the Space Marines, perhaps one of the more interesting versions of a sort of junk and low threat lone operative that's also very competitive is the Lieutenant with the combi weapon. He feels like one of the units that's most going to be commonly using the sort of screening, primary objective grabbing and secondary action doing, given that he's just not really all that much threat otherwise. He hits with a few AP0 and anti-infantry style attacks, and debuffs a midfield objective so he gets 2 reroll wound rolls of 1 against enemies that go there. Not awful, but maybe not absolutely game-changing on the damage front either. He's just an interesting unit though, as he's just weirdly tanky with a 5+ feel no pain and stealth, so it's very hard to gun down at range. And if you do try and catch up with him to catch him up in melee, he gets that evade and survive rule, which means that he gets to make a 6-inch normal move whenever you move a unit within 9 inches of him. That really brings all sort of disruptive options if you have him on the front lines around the midfield objectives. Potentially means that if you've lined up shooting on him, he could just fade away behind terrain. If you want to catch him in combat, he could move 6 inches further away from you. And if he does a nuisance charge on one of your units that doesn't want to remain in combat, then if it falls back, he'll often be able to wander off elsewhere, maybe to an objective or to safety. He does feel like perhaps the epitome of a lone operative that's just going to be a true nuisance, even if he's not going to contribute very much damage personally. For the Tyranids, their lone operatives seem to be almost auto-include in the Neurolictor and the Death Leaper. Neurolictors are 80 points, and fairly tanky lone operatives that just have a really interesting Battle Shock special rule. In your command phase, you can Battle Shock one enemy within 12 inches, and it doesn't need line of sight either, so you could have it completely out of line of sight, but in range of an objective marker, potentially stopping your opponents from contesting that objective against your forces. From there, that unit, if it does still remain within 12 inches of the Neurolictor and its battle shocked, gets a +1 to wound for the rest of your Tyranid forces against it, which is perhaps a surprisingly savage damage debuff, particularly if you have it combined with a whole bunch of mid-strength firepower like Exocrines perhaps. They often seem to fight paired with Death Leaper as well at 80 points, who's again just a tanky lone operative with stealth, a 4+ invulnerable save, and 7 wounds, more than a lot of lighter infantry squads can handle. Fights first with a whole flurry of strength 7 and damage 2 attacks that could utterly maul some Space Marines, and another disruptive battle shock rule that could occasionally allow you to flip an objective from the enemy's control to yours. I feel like between Death Leaper and the Neurolictors, they kind of epitomise a lot of the good stuff that the lone operatives do, maybe lurking just behind the lines and being around to do secondary objectives and things, but also being just all around hard to remove and do have enough damage output to threaten lighter enemy units trying to get to grips with them. You definitely can't just run at them with your lightest armoured stuff and expect no reprisal. Perhaps one of the most potentially surprisingly dangerous for the cost is the Reductor Saboteur for the Genestealer cults. She comes with perhaps a surprising amount of explosive surprises. Some indirect fire remote explosives, demolition charges to lob at the enemy within 6 inches for a very nice general purpose damage output, a free grenade stratagem for mortal wounds within 8 inches, and then planted explosives to deal damage to enemies moving within 12 inches, potentially getting a massive D3+3 mortal wounds. Between all that and lone operative disruption, you've got a pretty godly unit there. Seems like just what you want to maybe have standing behind terrain near a midfield objective and then step up to the plate. Hopefully blast any enemy units that try and take a midfield point for the big mortal wound thing, and then step up with demo charges and grenades to finish the job. I feel like the Reductor Saboteur really does take the lone operative thing to extremes though. She might be perhaps one of the very dangerous, but is also one of the very most fragile if you can catch up with her. Only 3 wounds with a 5+ save and stealth is going to get taken down by just about anything in the game the first time she gets attacked. So it's definitely going to either need to play cagey or brave, and accept that she's probably sacrificial after the bombing run's done. Perhaps one of the biggest and most interesting lone operatives out there are the Tau Ghost Kill battlesuits. 160 points for a great big stealth suit with a Fusion Collider or Cyclic Ion Raker. I'd likely be most tempted by the Ion Raker for a bunch of Strength 8, Damage 3 attacks from the backfield, and coming out from a battlesuit that's actually surprisingly tanky even if you can manage to catch up with it, given stealth a 2+ save and those stealth drones to cancel damage twice per game. I feel like this one's quite an interesting one that you can have just sat out in the open and shooting you and screening parts of the rest of the Tau army. Its damage output really isn't good, but it is interesting having meaningful firepower coming out of something with the lone operative rule, as it can put enemies in the awkward position of them being able to be shot but not shoot you. I feel like one of these in a Tau list is particularly interesting, maybe wandering around the peripheries of the board, either trying to guard your home field objective or snag one of the peripheral ones late game and try and put the rest of that good durability to work when the opponent just really isn't going to be able to handle it. Going back to the Space Marines, it's perhaps worth mentioning the Phobos Librarian and Infiltrators combo. These guys basically give you a lone operative unit that holds down the home field point. The Infiltrators deny deep strike out to 12 inches, and the Phobos Librarian denies shooting out to 12 inches, giving them a sort of pseudo lone operative rule. And you don't even have to roll to cast it or anything like that, it just happens. It's definitely a pricey investment for holding down a home field point, but about as safe as it can be really. It means that if your opponent doesn't have the movements to reach and attack your unit on the board, they can't do it with indirect fire, and they certainly can't do it with anything coming out of Deep Strike Reserve. They'll have to come in greater than 12 inches away so you can't charge your squad, and as they have to come in greater than 12 inches away, they can't shoot you either, giving the Librarian's protection. The squad's definitely not good for damage output as you'd expect for all that investment, though the Librarian does maybe give it just a little bit more pushback than it would have otherwise. You could threaten to smite down some Space Marines at least. The Astra Militarum gaunts Ghosts to 100 points and gives you a lone operative squad with a bit of a difference, with an actually maybe surprisingly tanky unit considering it already gets that good protection, stealth and then 2 wounds per model for most of them, so 13 wounds in total. In the first turn they could potentially sit somewhere safe out in the open and put a little bit of autocannon fire and sniper fire into the enemy. Then each turn return to reserve, essentially combat kind of similar to the deep strike style rule. Maybe do secondary objectives if necessary, and actually threaten maybe a surprising amount of damage on the enemy. They'll often be hitting on 2s given that they can now order once they've deep struck, and could have enough firepower to clear out lighter enemy units with the volley of las guns, and the autocannon and damage force sniper could certainly threaten to take out a heavier infantry model, hopefully chipping away at something important each turn. In the later turns of the game they could certainly threaten to take out primary objectives as well, maybe trying to go for the enemy unit they can best handle on 1 point. And you do have a squad of 6 objective control that can be ordered all the way up to 12. These guys just seem all around efficient, both for chipping in a little bit of damage as you go, while giving you a solid advantage on the victory points. Finally, for a quick tour through a few of the interesting lone operatives, I thought I'd mention the Solitaire as well. Eldari do have a few good lone operatives, including the Autarch Wayleaper with their command points, and the Death Jester's quite fun as well. The Solitaire, I think, is a particularly interesting one at 115 points though, really quite a big lone operative investment, but also quite a hilariously threatening one as well. A massive 12-inch move that could get you zipping around, doing screening or secondaries where you need to, maybe jumping from terrain to terrain. If he catches up with any infantry units, he's going to take a massive chunk out of them. Now attacks hitting on a 2 with strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2 is threatening enough to entire squad's worth of Space Marines, and it's got precision to potentially take out enemy characters. And for 1 turn, which you'd want to trigger when it jumps into combat, you'd get an extra 2d6-inch movement for a spectacularly close charge, and an extra 3 attacks as well, just in case you needed that extra boost to cut through the enemy. You can also advance and charge as well, really quite powerful to be able to have a unit like this just zip all the way from one side of the board to the other in a pinch. Could do lone operative screening and secondary annoyance type things for a bit, and then jump in to utterly ruin one enemy squad or character. Again, he's a bit all or nothing, really quite fragile on the counter attack. A 3+ invulnerable save is all very exciting, but when you toughness 3 and only 3 wounds, 1 bad hit could take him down. Just in general, there really are quite a lot of efficient lone operatives there, including a few others that I haven't mentioned. That's not the end of the places where you can actually get the rule though, as there's plenty of other things that can grant a similar sort of protection. Some stratagems can stop you being shot at greater than 12 inches or greater than 18-inch range, things like the Necron Canoptek Court or the Kroot Hunting Pack. I feel like anyone who's played against them know that they're really quite powerful, potentially can do really disruptive things to the enemy shooting phase, maybe allowing them to do a bit of chip damage to a unit before deciding that you want to shield it when they dedicate something that could actually seriously threaten to kill it, and potentially leaving the opponent guessing until the last minute, and having to reprioritise their shooting after they finally know what's been hidden. You could also use it to basically just say no to enemy shooting against a critical unit just about to score you some really big points. That could be one way in which you could trade some command points very directly for victory points there. Otherwise, some characters could grant lone operative to a squad, like the Phobos Librarian with Infiltrators as mentioned, Strike with Jump Packs, or Illic with Rangers for the Eldari. The units do kind of feel like they might be paying for a bit of a premium given that they get the protection and maybe aren't really all that durable per point if you catch up with them, but they're definitely pretty interesting, and some of them can be quite strong. Finally, there's some characters out there that can get it as sort of like a bodyguard style rule. Lots of the mechanic style units get that, like Tech Marines, Warpsmiths, or Tech Priest Engine Seers next to vehicles. You can't shoot them if they stay close to their mechanical charges. Or some other bigger characters like Gilliman the Lion or Illuminor Seraz. I feel like these are also quite interesting from a lone operative point of view, provided you can keep the vehicle safe or you know that your opponent doesn't have enough firepower to destroy it this turn. Then until that point you know that your character's got some lone operative protection. You could even use them to be holding down objectives or get maybe more aggressive lines of sight that they wouldn't often be brave enough to do if they knew they had to hide from enemy guns. You can also do that kind of weird combo with Gilliman and the Lion if you had them next to, say, the Combi Weapon Lieutenant or the Phobos Librarian in a squad. You could have both units have lone operative and not be able to be shot, as their rule keys off infantry. It doesn't seem to be quite enough to have them top tier competitive or anything like that, but I feel like it's pretty interesting if you were putting them on the board. In any case, hope you've enjoyed a few thoughts on lone operatives. Let me know which ones you've been finding useful in game, or which ones have been causing you frustration to your gun lines. Look forward to hearing your ideas down in the comments below. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more like this, and if you'd like to help support the creation of future videos, then feel free to check out the Patreon page as well down in the video description. It is the main way that I can keep on making videos like this quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.